Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah. Hayya ala salah, hayya ala salah, hayya ala falah, hayya ala falah. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you. By the grace and mercy of Allah, I thank you for tuning in this evening for the program, A Message to the Oppressed. Tonight's topic is Who Are the Moors, Part 1. My guest is Danifu Sayyid Abdul Karim Bey. Assalamu alaikum. Now, who are the Moors?
Well, first off, the easiest way to deal with that is the Moors are the people who went down in history for conquering or civilizing Spain. However, that doesn't specifically tell you who they are as far as in today's time. And so the easiest way to say that is black people are the Moors. You do have Moroccan Arabs, but the Moroccan Arab and the Mobite Moroccans are two different people. They may be related, just like Jews or so-called Jews, and Arabs are considered Hebrews, and they call them Semitics. Those two groups are related to another group called Hamitic, which we now call Kemetic, which is named after Egypt, and they call them Kemet. So the Moors, if you read books like Ivan Van Sertimer's African Presence in Early Europe, you'll find that Ivan Van Sertimer was under the opinion that the Moors were the original descendant of the Garamantes, who were Adamites, and the direct descendants of the Garamantes were the Mandinkas or the Mandé, who were the true Moors, because you had a lot of amalgamation going on throughout history, especially when the Greeks began to take over the world. They conquered much of North Africa and India and places of that nature, and changed the surface of the earth in terms of identity, as they caused the original so-called African civilization to migrate into the excuse me, sub-Saharan Africa. So the easiest way to answer that is that so-called black people are Moors, and until relatively recent, which is like 200 years ago, when you had European so-called scholars like Blumenbeck, who began to redefine people in the 17th century. And so, you know, this when they came up with that Mongoloid, Negroid, and Caucasoid definition to justify slavery and their superiority, superior status. And so the term Negro, black, and colored is relatively recent, even on the state records in the United States. Prior to 1776, these names were not technical names used to define African people in the Western Hemisphere. So when you ask who are the Moors, it's kind of vast, because everywhere you look on earth, whether in India, where the oldest place in India is called Mohenjo-daro, or you look in the Philippines, where you have the so-called Filipinos, who were named after King Philip of Spain. Before then, previously they were called Moros. Or you go to New Zealand and you check the indigenous people, who are called Maoris, or the Samoans for that matter, or even Eskimos, or Mohawks, or Mohicans, or the Algonquian tribes in North America before Columbus came. These terms were derived directly from the ancient Mobite civilization that was the first civilization. And so they had opportunity to go all across the planet Earth before any other group, like Hanno, which was a brother or uncle of Hannibal, who conquered Rome for a time with the elephants. They had evidence that Hanno had been to pre-Columbian America, just like they have evidence of Hanno and the Carthaginian civilization being the mother civilization of Ghana, Songhai, and Mali. If you study linguistics, you find, according to Sheikh Anta Diop, that the Fulanke, the Mandinke, and the Soninke are all related to the ancient Moabite tribes of the Carthaginian civilization, who were directly related to ancient Moab, which is actually what we call ancient Arabia, where you had the Jurham, which were actually the Yurkim tribes and ancient Moabite tribes of Arabia, like the Yoruba, who Muhammad Sharif cites in one of his books as being Banu Canaan. And it's taught that the Moors were of the house or family of Canaan, the original Canaanites. And then you come across the Igbo tribe, which are the original Hebrews. So our concept of history and who is who today is quite distorted by people who obviously been trying to confuse people in regards to identity for some unknown reason. But the Moors are just what we call black people today, or dark people, or wherever you have people that have melanin. The terminology used today is new. Prior to blooming back in the races of the 17th and 18th century, people were defined according to tribe and nation. And so we do have evidence that there were people not only from North Africa, Morocco, here in America. We have evidence to prove that the languages of many of the tribes of the Native Americans, like the Nantico, which are Algonquians and Iroquois, the language of them is actually the Mandinka language. And this is why linguistics is so important when you're trying to, trace a family tree or what have you. And so, if you have any other questions, or maybe it would help, because I go on and on. For example, most people consider the Moabites to be descendants of the prophet Lot in the Bible. And the prophet Lot was supposed to be the nephew of Abraham. But when you look in the Bible in the Old Testament, you see in Numbers, I think is chapter 24, verse 17, that the ancient Moabites were the descendants of Seth, who was the third surviving son of Adam. And it mentions in that part that they were being destroyed, that the scepter of rulership was being handed over to Israel, which at that time were Hebrews, which was just another group of Moors that were amalgamated with the Greeks and the now emerging Romans that were coming on the scene. Ancient Moabite civilization pretty much declined at the same time Egyptian civilization declined. But if people are not familiar with Jay Rogers and some of his works, they won't know the significance.
So in reference to the central land mass where the Moors originated from, and the peoples and their descendants with the mass migration that occurred throughout history, would be Kemet, would be Egypt?
Yes and no. Well, we could say yes insofar as Egypt being, or Kemet being, the foundation of modern civilizations today, and yes, Moors, or so-called black people, were there. But when you read the book from the brother, what's his name? Windsor, Rudolph Windsor, he has From Babylon to Timbuktu. He wrote that book. Very good book. Black people or Moors were all the way into Babylon. We laid the foundation of the Babylonian civilization, and there was a migration out of that region into Africa. So you have a lot of arguments over whether or not we came from somewhere other than Africa into Africa, or we came from Africa to those other places. But, you know, right now you're having a lot of new things coming out.
What was the main belief of the people? Monotheism, animism, etc. What was their main beliefs?
As
well as the political and socioeconomic system.
The different opinions on the concepts of God have a lot to do with interpretation. And it appears that the original man, or the first people, had the concept of one God. But then, since languages began to differ, that one God began to take on different names. But the Moabites went down in history, you know, through the biblical, by being known as nature worshipers or animists, like Africans. They describe the Africans real vaguely like. You don't know what the African really believes because they use terms that the layman doesn't understand. And so when you talk about nature worship or being, I guess, respecting nature, people don't understand that here in America. And so that's what they went down in history for, being more of a nature cult, even though you can't really separate nature from God. And so, and the political, social, and economic structure of the ancient Moabites or Moabite civilization or Egyptian civilization or Kemetic civilization is basically communalism. However, you have at different times in history, you have different economic formations. And when you study, you'll realize that the ancient Moabites were not only the backbone of the Egyptian army, they were referred to as the Phoenicians. They were the Egyptian Navy. And when it comes to the religious aspects of ancient Egypt or Kemet, you find that the Moabite priests were a priest clan, and that's why Ruth, who was a Moabitess, who is a full mother of Jesus, was so important in the mixing of those two groups, because she, through Ruth, who was a Moabitess, came the descendants of the prophets out of Israel, and it didn't go through another branch. And so when you understand the relationship between the ancient Moabites and civilization, you get a better idea. But by studying ancient civilization under various names, Ethiopian, African, Black, Kemet, we don't really understand the ramifications of why they keep changing the names. And every time they change a name, they hide something. And so, you know.
What about in reference to the prophets, as you mentioned, the prophet Abraham, peace upon him, and also with two of his sons, the oldest son Ishmael and his youngest son Isaac, peace upon them, in reference to their identity and their descendants and their beliefs?
Well, the way I learned it was that Abraham was a prophet, and so was Lot, and that their religion was obedience to God. And in Islam, or Arabic language, that would be Islam. However, the Moabite Arabs were people who were continuously being subjected to foreign powers for some reason. And most of the group in Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed for various things, but they were immoral like America is, right? Sodom, the word sodomite comes from there, and Gomorrah, no telling what word derives from that. But these particular black people were not civilized. They were not moral. So Lot and his family were commissioned to give them a message of civilization and the message of the one God. Nobody listened, so they were destroyed. So the Moabite Arabs were just roughly the Moabites who preserved the Arabic language and were amongst the family of Abraham. And those were the Moors that survived, so they would be Moors in this day and time. And so that's my understanding of it. They're basically the same group. But when we come into history from a point of view of Semite, Hamite, and Japhite, it's kind of deceptive, because we find that most Semitic peoples interchangeably all of a sudden become Hamitic. And then around the 17th century, the Hamitic people, since they found out that they were not slaves like they had reported and cursed to be slaves by God to be black because they laughed at Noah, Hamites began to be said, they said they were white first and then they were cursed to be black, or they were actually white. So some confusion came into that part, because the Hamitic civilization was actually the foundation of modern civilization. And the Semitic and Hamitic civilizations were interchangeable. So, in other words, you can define Arabic and Hebrew as Semitic, but then you would have to put Swahili or Hausa or Yoruba in the same category as Semitic, because they all have the same base, which is the Phoenician language, which is the ancient Moabite language. The ancient Moabite language is the foundation of all that Bantu language that's contained within the Arabic and the Hebrew languages. And these are things that obviously they don't want to come out, as well as them being so-called black people. And the different ranges and complexions of black people kind of make it hard, because when you have somebody like Cleopatra, who has obviously had Greek ancestry, they want to define her as a Caucasian for their advantage. Or you say that the ancient Syrians were actually Egyptians, so if the ancient Syrians they find it evidence they were in North Africa, then they'll give credit to the foundation of African civilization, the Syrians, because the present-day Syrians have been amalgamated with the French. So we figured that a Syrian today must be a Caucasian, the Syrian of yesterday must be Caucasian. And even some definitions of a Semite would be Caucasian. So that would make all the prophets that we know of Caucasians. So when you look at what the European has done when he moved into power as far as militarily, economically, and psychologically or socially, then we see that it's just a smokescreen and confusion of tongues. By taking your name is like castrating you. In the Bible, you know, they say, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long lived in the earth land that thy Lord thy God hath given thee. Well, the easiest way to dishonor your forefathers is to not recognize their names, their surnames, your genealogy. So black people in America, throughout the world, have been stripped of their genealogy, and specifically black people in America and in the Philippines and the Native Americans were given Christian names and rerouted, redefined, given different names. When Columbus came here, he called the people Indians, but this wasn't India. So what were the people's names before he landed here? And what were the people's names before they named them Negroes? Were they Negroes in Africa? Of course not. According to their sources, in 1619, we know this is not the original date that slavery began in America, but that's when the Anglo-Saxons began the date. They say in 1619 they brought 21 Senegalese here. Well, why not call them Sengali? Why rename them? Because this is a tactic that the Europeans do. If you're his property, you take his name. He's your stepfather and your stepmammies. He's the rapist. He's the kidnapper. He's the God. He's the master. He takes your religion. He takes your language. He takes your history. He takes your future. Matter of fact, everything in this civilization, for the most part, is something that already existed. But they try to make you think it's something new. They have created virtually nothing new. It's just that we don't know that much about the past beyond 6,000 years, therefore we
accept anything.
accept anything.
Like in reference to the identity of the Moors, and you made mention of Spain. And in the text and in the educational or miseducational institutions, Dr. Carter G. Woodson mentions in the Miseducation of the Negro when he emphasizes that it's imperative to know about the Tariq al-Sudan, Tariq al-Fatash. In reference to the Moors and the time of the Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah, peace be upon him, from the 7th century, and their acceptance of Islam, what was some of the accomplishments and to civilization in the legacy and the continuity of what had preceded them?
Well, in the 7th century, you have a rise of what we would call a return to ancient civilization. And as the Moors, who were direct descendants of the ancient Moabites, when the black people, when they embraced the new religion of Islam, it enabled them to polish up and develop the arts and sciences and mathematics, chemistry, physics. These are the kind of things that we were into at the beginning. And these are the type of things that we contributed once we were able to resurrect what we call Egyptian civilization. If you read a book called Stolen Legacy by, James, in page 118, you have what he called the resurrection of Egyptian civilization by way of the Moors of Senegal. And this is the culture that they took to Spain, which was Egyptian. However, it was Islam that enabled them to unite and codify the particular arts and sciences that we had been preserving ever since the fall of Egypt. And by unifying and codifying so-called black people, African people, were able to move forward as a united group, somewhat like Pan-Africanism. Islam in Africa was used to unite the tribes, the warring factions, Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Fula, Mande, Soniki. Instead of each tribe having its own particular religion and own God, which the way it was before in the past, which enabled the Romans to conquer Egypt, they begin to unify on another level of recognizing that it was one God. That enabled them to arrive at a concept of one aim, and history bears witness to 700 years of a common destiny. And basically, if not for the Moors in Spain, Europe would have not been introduced to algebra, mathematics, trigonometry, electronics, physics, chemistry. Chemistry has its root in Chem, which is Egypt. Chem is just another word for ham. It's just another letter put in there that's in the Arabic and the alphabet that is not in the Roman script. So the contributions of the Moors are like the contribution of world civilization. The Moors were 500 years ahead of the Europeans. Most of the scholars that are unbiased about the history of the Moors in Spain would agree that had the Moors continued in Spain, world civilization would have been 500 years into the future at present. So Islam and its effect and its role with the Moors in Europe was actually what brought about modern civilization, where they had plumbing and lighting and schools and baths. You have to imagine that the European at the time that the Moors went into Spain were pretty much on the caveman level. They still had knights and nobles and castles and drinking blood, and not believing in taking bath was a sin and a crime in Europe. And so people don't really understand these things because of the notions that they've been given by European scholarship at present, that if any civilization existed in the past, a white man did it.
Instead, the Moors were the ones.
Right.
As we close out, I'd like to thank you, by the grace and mercy of Allah, for disseminating information for liberation. And hopefully by the grace and mercy of Allah, we'll continue with part 2 on who are the Moors. And may Allah bless you to continue to be able to present this type of information to everyone that you come in contact with and those who you do not. By the grace and mercy of Allah, I'd like to thank you for tuning in this evening for A Message to the Oppressed with my guest, Danifu Sayyid Abdul Kareem Bey. I am your host, Al-Hajj Muhammad Abdullah, and by the grace and mercy of Allah, I find it really interesting that we are able to get someone of the magnitude of Brother Danifu, because as I made mention of one textbook by Dr. Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro, and this is what people are afflicted with regardless of their race, ethnicity, belief, etc., through the miseducational institution that is inherent in the oppression that exists not only in America but wherever colonialism and oppression is. And it is Islam that liberates all people. And Allah, out of His mercy, has sent prophets from Adam to Muhammad ibn Abdullah, peace be upon him, to free all people of all worship except the worship of the one sovereign of the universe. And in the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah, peace upon him, who could not read nor could he write, was honored by Allah with that revelation. You can write us at P.O. Box 338, Compton, California, 90221, or call 323-470-4869. Assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you.